Okay, folks. Just a quick civil rights video, really. Um, I'm going to do this on freedom rides and freedom marches. What I would say to you is be very careful on the exam of getting what's in the 50s and what's in the 60s, because they sometimes will ask on a specific decade or the like. Now, freedom rides happened in 1961, so it's clearly the 60s, and it's really a follow-up to what had happened with Rosa Parks. We know that racial segregation had been made illegal. The Supreme Court had stepped in. It was somewhat of a victory. This would extend to bus terminals, it would extend to restaurants, it would extend to waiting rooms where black Americans, couldn't before go into the same areas as white Americans. And what you get is you eventually get freedom rides happening. Now, freedom rides are the interstate buses, which, it's sort of like a National Express. It's the Greyhound buses if you're in America, and it's when you could journey from the north into the south or vice versa. So the original freedom riders were 13 people. 7 of them were black and 6 of them were white. And the freedom rides went from Washington DC, which was the nation's capital, into the deep south. And the story goes that on the 14th of May 1961, when Birmingham, Alabama received the Freedom Riders, the KKK basically just beat them up as they got off the bus, beat them up on the bus, and slashed the tyres of the bus, and very, very little was done. So again, as I've said before, police in the south, there was this belief all the way back to the 40s where Truman was trying to get the police to act professionally without prejudice, were allowing this thing to happen because they went along with the racist views. So the Ku Klux Klan were attacking the buses. The following day, the 15th of May, the bus driver didn't like what he was being asked to do, didn't want any part of it, and they had to be flew to New Orleans. We've got on the 17th of May, we've got 10 freedom riders who were arrested in Birmingham, Alabama. They were taken 150 miles away, but when they go back to Birmingham again, they can't find a driver to take them on. By the 20th of May, you've got the KKK doing what they did before, more attacks, more injuries. And Martin Luther King, who, if you want to be a critic of King, people would say, well, why wasn't he on the freedom rides? King did speak to freedom riders on the 21st of May 1961, and the church he spoke to them in had to be surrounded and protected by the National Guard due to the fears that of attacks that would happen in King's, personal well-being. And by the 24th of May, we've got 27 freedom riders who were arrested in Jackson, basically for going to a white-only waiting room. So the waiting rooms were not segregated. And by the end of that summer of 1961, we had another 328 riders were arrested. But it did end to the desegregation in the interstate buses and the waiting rooms and restaurants and the like. So if you went into an American bus depot for like Greyhound interstate buses, you would find there's usually coffee shops, waiting rooms, like you're in a small airport. And these had not been desegregated, and now they were, and the regulations were passed to stop this segregation. So the freedom rides were a success. Personally, I think the most interesting story around freedom rides was the one of Jim Zwerg, which is ZWERG, and Jim Zwerg was one of the original 13, and Jim spoke on a documentary I was watching, PBS Freedom Riders. And he said that the Freedom Riders, he himself had grown up in very much a white background and hadn't known people who were black, but this changed when he went to college, or university as we call it. And he was horrified by scenes he saw in the Deep South and wanted to do something about it. So he agreed to become a Freedom Rider. And he said that when they had their meeting about what was going to happen, they were told to write a letter home, because there was a very real chance that they weren't going to come back, that they were putting their lives at risk here. And Jim Zwerg decided to go one step further and phoned his parents, and he said he felt as though he hoped that he would be greeted as though he was a soldier going to war, as like a hero, and far from it. Instead, Jim was told by his mother that he was killing his dad, and when he did go on the freedom rides, he was attacked. So he was one of the ones who the KKK got to, and the reports were that the KKK spent more attention on the white freedom riders than the black freedom riders, who did get attacked, but the white ones took a hell of a beating, in particular Jim's work. And Jim was actually like made newspaper news. Basically the cameras, you can pick up the footage still of his work, saying he wanted to continue but he couldn't because he'd been beaten that badly. But the idea from the KKK was that white Americans were starting to support black Americans, and this was a huge fear and terror for them. So they wanted to scare them. They wanted to stop it from happening. So how were they going to do it? By violence, physical threat. Okay, so the Jim's Work case is a good one to reference if you're asked about 1960s anything about it. If you can bring up freedom rides and you can get work in there, it's good. It's beyond the textbook. Alright, now what you also had going in the early 60s was freedom marches. The freedom marches weren't just about civil rights, but you also had huge problems by 1962 in the USA of overall unemployment and poverty issues. So it wasn't just civil rights, it was a lack of jobs and poverty facing people, both black and white. So the freedom marches were a march for jobs and freedom, and there were hundreds of these marches between 62 and 63, and they reckon there was over like 900 demonstrations in over 100 cities in 1963. 20,000 people were arrested. Now this was against what Martin Luther King would have wanted, because he wanted non-violent protests, so he didn't want to see trouble. He wanted to sort of like rise above and show this very positive face of civil rights. So he was a key organizer in the August 1963 March on Washington DC, and basically the organization that went into that, and I've got a post-it note just next to the camera here: 292 toilets, 212 fountains, so people could drink and go to the toilet in a civilized way, I guess, and keep hydrated. 22 first aid stations, 40 doctors, 80 nurses. Bearing in mind it was a war on poverty and unemployment, 80,000 packed lunches were supplied so people didn't go hungry. 5,600 police on duty, 4,000 soldiers. So you can see how organised this freedom march was, the one in Washington. Now, to go along with this, other marches all over America were coordinated, and these didn't just happen within America but abroad as well, where embassies, town halls, etc. would be met by people protesting peacefully what had gone on in this struggle for civil rights and jobs. And it brought it to the public's attention, and nothing more caught the public's attention than probably the greatest historical speech of all time, the most famous historical speech probably of all time, I Have a Dream, where Martin Luther King made his famous I Have a Dream speech. He emphasized the I Have a Dream by repeating it. He quoted the American national anthem in what he spoke, so he showed himself a patriot. He made sure to reference various points of the USA, so he wasn't just talking about one part, he was talking about all of it. And he had this dream of black and white and all races living together in harmony, which he made very, very, very clear in a very, very eloquent fashion. And this was basically the hope for a better future with non-violent protest. And there's been a change in president by this point, and you've got young JFK, President Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and this was said to have played a key role in him, looking at civil rights. And he went on to meet the organisers of the Washington March, and it showed everyone, not just the president, that the status of black Americans was changing for the better. It shouldn't have had to have been shown, but this really put a positive light on it. And for the racist groups like the KKK, this was like their biggest threat now, because you had a charismatic leader, a great speaker, eloquent, honourable, educated, clean cut, and basically preaching peace in Martin Luther King, and he was a huge threat to them. And the response to it all was that they had the Birmingham Sunday bombings, where the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed in Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama, and it was a reaction to the Washington March and the I Have a Dream, and the idea again of, if we can't get our way, the KKK, then we'll do it by terror, we'll scare people off. And it was really, even though it was horrific that the 4 young children were killed, it was probably the stupidest thing they could have done, because it brought more attention to civil rights. They've killed 4 young girls at church. You know, you couldn't have made a more stupid protest if you tried. You know, these 4 girls, 4 girls in church, innocent people dead, and it causes outrage, and it causes more people rightfully to side with the civil rights cause, horrified from what they've seen and heard. It did lead to race riots, so we saw 2 more youths were killed. We saw a black youth shot for stoning white cars. We saw 2 white teenagers on a bike shoot a 13-year-old black boy on a bike and his brother. So there was racial tension running high. But again, the whole idea of scaring people away from civil rights with the Birmingham bombing didn't work. 8,000 people turned up for the funeral of 3 of the girls. People from churches of all races turned up, including Martin Luther King, but very tellingly in Birmingham, Alabama, no officials from the city turned up. So you haven't got mayors and stuff like that, they don't turn up to this. So it gives you an idea of what at least the certain people in Birmingham thought or feared for their positions. But the civil rights, the Washington March and the subsequent Birmingham bombing afterwards, very, very powerful, caught the eyes of the president, and also horrified the nation. The idea of scaring people away from civil rights actually brought more supporters to the cause as a result of what the KKK feared from the I Have a Dream speech and the success of the Washington Freedom March. So thanks for watching, folks.